All right, everyone, settle in. Tonight, we're delving into the grim, dangerous, and decidedly unglamorous reality of medieval assassins. Those shadowy figures who supposedly crept through castle halls and darkened alleys, blade in hand, to silently alter history. While Hollywood often portrays them as impossibly cool, the truth is, being a medieval assassin was truly awful. So, before you get too comfortable, if you genuinely appreciate what I'm creating here, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe. And I'd love to know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's always genuinely fascinating to see our audience connecting from all corners of the globe. Now, go ahead and dim those lights, perhaps switch on a fan for that gentle background hum, and let's smoothly transition into tonight's journey together. Let's be clear, no one in medieval times woke up feeling inspired to stab a nobleman in the throat for a few silver coins and the privilege of hiding in a barrel for 3 days. Becoming an assassin wasn't a chosen career path. It was more like the final stop on a disastrous life journey. Most medieval assassins weren't mysterious loners from mountaintop temples. They were typically desperate peasants, disgraced soldiers, former thieves with decent aim, or individuals so marginalized by society that they could commit a murder and still go unnoticed in the census. If you were well off, you didn't become an assassin, you simply hired one. If you held a title, owned land, or even possessed a goat, you were in a position of command. But if you'd just escaped debtor's prison, had a reputation for solving problems, and could slip into a tavern unnoticed, then congratulations. Someone, somewhere, was likely about to slide a coin purse across a table and whisper a name. And that name wouldn't be a simple one. You weren't tasked with eliminating a quiet turnip farmer named Bob. It was usually a corrupt baron, a bishop with excessive wealth, or someone protected by 12 bodyguards in a moat. The pay was tempting, the job horrifying, but by the time someone considered it, they usually had nothing left to lose. No family, no future, and definitely no dental plan. Furthermore, let's not overlook the complete absence of job perks. There was no pension, no glory, no evenings off. You couldn't exactly advertise your services with a sign saying "Quiet Eliminations" by appointment. You simply had to remain quiet, move swiftly, and absolutely never reveal your profession, especially not loudly over a pint of ale at the inn. "Oh, I'm just a traveling carpet seller," you'd claim. "The stains, die." So no, nobody aspired to be a medieval assassin. They ended up in that role because life had chewed them up and spit them out, leaving them cloaked and wielding a rusty dagger. You weren't the hero, nor even the primary villain. You were a nervous footnote, likely not destined to live long enough to enjoy the payment. Let's immediately debunk the first myth. Medieval assassins didn't train by candlelight in some hidden monastery, guided by wise mentors and accompanied by inspirational flute music. There was no cinematic montage, no dedicated teacher, no motivational pep talk. Any skills you acquired came from surviving your initial attempts. Most assassins were desperate amateurs with a decent sense of direction and the knack for climbing quietly without sneezing. If you had military experience, that was a bonus, as it meant you knew how to hold a knife properly. If not, well, while stabbing is fairly intuitive, escaping afterwards with both kidneys intact required either skill or, more often, sheer luck. There were no training manuals, no guild orientation meetings, no safety briefings. You weren't taught how to spot a body double or where nobles kept their secret exits. You learned these things while dangling from a windowsill, wondering if you'd once again stumbled into the servants' quarters. Poison? That was a matter of trial and error, heavily weighted towards error. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes your target merely felt a bit dizzy and became more suspicious of their soup. And sometimes you drank from the wrong cup yourself. There was no medieval poison control hotline, just hope, herbal guesswork, and a very strong stomach. Of course, if you were incredibly fortunate, and I mean found a gold coin in a dead man's shoe fortunate, you might have picked up a few tricks from thieves or mercenaries. Perhaps an older assassin showed you how to move silently on cobblestones. But mentorship was far from standard. It was rare and fleeting, because assassins rarely retire, they simply vanish. Weapon training? Forget it. You weren't carrying a broadsword. You had a dagger you'd stolen from a guard, perhaps a garrote if you were feeling ambitious, and whatever else could be concealed under your cloak without jingling. So no, you weren't some shadowy martial arts master. You were a person with calloused hands, quiet footsteps, and a deeply unhealthy familiarity with alleyways. Success didn't stem from training, it came from raw survival. You learned to kill by executing the act quickly, perhaps messily, then disappearing before anyone could sketch your face and nail it to a church door. In short, your education was brutal, practical, and offered no graduation ceremonies, only bruises, bloodstains, and the chilling realization that you were utterly alone. Let's talk about the primary reason you became an assassin: money. Cold, heavy, clinking, wonderfully spendable coins. The promise of this payment is what drew you into this life. But the reality? You were paid in deception. When someone hires an assassin, they aren't looking for a lasting relationship. They want a one-time service, no paper trail, and ideally, no witnesses. And that includes you. They might offer you a pouch of silver, half up front and half upon completion of the job. That's if they're feeling particularly generous. But here's the catch. Upon completion of the job is code for after we've confirmed you didn't botch it, or embarrass us, or leave a trail leading back to us, or survive long enough to tell anyone. So you perform the task. You navigate through shadows, risk your life, perhaps kill a baron in his sleep. It's not pretty, not poetic. And when you return, ah yes, about that payment, the client has vanished, terribly sorry. Or worse, they attempt to kill you. A knife to the gut is always cheaper than a bonus. And even when you do receive payment, it's rarely enough. Not for the risk, not for the bloodshed, not for the 3 days you spent hiding in a haystack, battling fleas and moral regret. You'd get a handful of coins, a curt nod, and a stark reminder you were never here. Oh, and a delightful detail. Some contracts were actually elaborate political traps. You'd be instructed to assassinate a dangerous figure, only to discover it was a decoy, surrounded by waiting guards. Congratulations, you've just walked into a sting operation with your name already carved on the gallows. And even if the deal was genuine, you couldn't exactly file a complaint in court. Your Honor, I'd like to sue Lord Edmund for breach of assassin contract. The only court you'd ever see would be one where you were the primary exhibit. So, you learned to take what you could get, demand upfront payment whenever possible, and trust absolutely no one. Not even the shifty scribe who swore this job would change your life. It did, mostly by drastically shortening it. Being an assassin meant living on broken promises and constantly trying to vanish before they broke you entirely. So you've accepted the job, you've been misled about the payment, you're probably going to die. Now let's discuss your equipment. Discard any notions from fantasy novels or stealth video games. There were no retractable wrist blades, no smoke bombs, no enchanted daggers. Your entire toolkit consisted of whatever you could pilfer, sharpen, or conceal beneath a tattered cloak without making a sound. If you were incredibly fortunate, and I mean found a gold coin in a dead man's shoe fortunate, you possessed a decent dagger. Not ornate, not curved like a dragon's tooth, just sharp, hopefully free of rust, and ideally one that didn't still reek of your last victim. Poison? It did exist, certainly, but it wasn't as elegant as a slow drip into a wine goblet. Most medieval poisons were erratic, concocted from plants, minerals, or even toad entrails. Some acted instantly, others took hours. Some merely induced 2 days of vomiting in your target, who would then recover, angrier and now highly suspicious of all future stews. Ropes could sometimes be useful. You could use one for strangling, climbing, or tying something up, but you'd better be proficient at using it quickly, because nothing ruins the moment like fumbling with knots while muttering, "Wait, which one goes under again?" Bows? Effective. Yes, if you happened to own one, knew how to use it, and weren't trying to smuggle it into a palace disguised as a flower arranger. Most assassinations were intimate and up close. There was no time for graceful marksmanship, just quick, quiet, and hopefully not so messy that you'd slip. And you had no backups. If your blade bent, broke, or tumbled into a well, it was time for improvisation. A slate roof tile? Perhaps. A rusty nail? Worth a try. A shoe buckle with malicious intent? Desperate times called for desperate measures. You carried your tools discreetly, hidden in hems, boots, or even inside hollowed-out bread if necessary. And you kept them close, not for safety, but because in this line of work, your weapon was your closest companion, your taskmaster, and your sole retirement plan. There were no upgrades, no meticulous gear adjustments between missions. You didn't polish your kit, you prayed it wouldn't fail you mid-strike, because ultimately, it wasn't the weapon that killed. It was you, alone, poorly equipped, and expected to perform miracles with the equivalent of a spoon and a prayer. Assassins weren't hired to eliminate random drunks in dark alleys. No one would pay you to stab Jeff, the sleepy candlemaker. Your targets were significant individuals, nobles, bishops, military officers, sometimes even royalty, and these people were exceptionally difficult to kill. Firstly, there were the guards, not just one or two, but dozens. They were armed, armored, and well-fed. Some stood watch at the front, others at the rear. Some simply exuded intimidation, daring you to make a wrong move. You'd spend days meticulously memorizing patrol patterns, the creaks of doors, and precisely how many stairs it took before the asthmatic guard needed a breather. Secondly, there were the walls. Castles lacked inviting front porches. Instead, they featured formidable gatehouses, deadly murder holes, and moats filled with biting creatures. If you avoided falling into the water, you still had to contend with arrow slits and boiling oil. Yes, boiling oil. Your job description effectively included may get flambéed for peeking. Thirdly, there were the countless servants and staff, the cooks, scribes, and stable boys. One wrong glance from you, and they'd be whispering to the guard captain faster than you could stammer, "I'm just the herbalist." Assassins weren't just battling swords, they were battling gossip. And medieval gossip traveled at astonishing speed if it meant someone could keep their head. And finally, your actual target was justifiably paranoid. These individuals were surrounded by backstabbers, relatives vying for their titles, and dozens of people feigning loyalty. They wouldn't eat without a taster. They wouldn't sleep without 3 locks on their door. Some even used decoy beds or rotated rooms in a deadly version of musical chairs. And don't get excited if you heard they were attending a feast. Yes, they'd be drunk, but so would you. And you'd still need to bypass the royal guards, 3 protective dogs, a very alert jester, and 50 tankard-holding witnesses. Even getting physically close to your target could consume weeks, posing as a servant, bribing a chambermaid, or hiding in barrels. And when the moment finally arrived, you had one chance. One precise, perfect, silent, bloodless, vanishing into the night moment. Otherwise, you'd become the next public deterrent, swinging from the castle gate with a sign proclaiming, "Nice try." Let's be honest. When you envision a medieval assassin, you likely picture sleek black robes, leather bracers, perhaps a mysterious hood billowing in the moonlight. The reality? You looked more like a sickly goat herder with something to conceal. Disguises in the Middle Ages weren't exactly haute couture. You didn't have custom-tailored cloaks or retractable armor. You had whatever you could scavenge. Peasant rags, a monk's robe 2 sizes too large, or the remnants of a guard uniform that definitely still carried the scent of its previous owner. The goal was to blend in. But blending in meant looking like everyone else who hadn't bathed in 2 weeks, limped from old injuries, and possessed a nervous twitch from malnutrition. You weren't suspicious because of your cloak. You were suspicious because you constantly adjusted your belt to hide a dagger wrapped in cheesecloth. And forget about masks. There were no Guy Fawkes options. Most face coverings simply made you appear to be a leper, which was excellent for avoiding conversation, but terrible for entering social gatherings. If anyone questioned your identity, you had to think quickly. I'm Brother Tobias. I specialize in silent prayer and rooftop maintenance. Even assuming you managed to bypass the guards, noble households weren't populated by fools. Servants noticed unfamiliar faces, especially those who fumbled chamber pots and couldn't identify the cook's cat. You were always one, "I've never seen you before," away from being assaulted with a candlestick. And if your disguise did work, congratulations. You now had to maintain your character for hours, pretending not to notice all the highly stab-worthy individuals wandering by. Also, wigs, they didn't exist. If you needed to appear older or younger, you were left to smear dirt on your face, squint, and hope no one approached close enough to realize your beard was adhered with honey. The truth was, your disguise offered minimal protection. It merely bought you perhaps 5 minutes of confusion. After that, you needed to be gone, invisible, or exceptionally convincing. And if anyone saw through it, well, let's just say no one wants to be the assassin apprehended in the bishop's laundry room, clad in a nun's habit and clutching a sword, especially not on a feast day. In medieval times, if you were an assassin, you operated alone. You didn't have a sidekick with a crossbow, a cunning alchemist in a secret lair, or a handler providing coded scrolls and warm encouragement. You had only yourself, a rusty dagger, and crippling trust issues. There were no guilds, at least none you could genuinely rely on. And if rumors of a brotherhood of assassins circulated, it was mostly tavern gossip fueled by mead and boredom. You were more likely to encounter a ghost than another professional killer interested in networking. Why this isolation? Because in your line of work, the fewer people who knew you existed, the longer you lived. Every contact was a risk, every careless word, a potential noose. Even your client might not know your true name. And if they did, you were already devising your escape plan. Companionship? Laughable. Friends asked probing questions. Lovers would notice bruises, bloodstains, and why you always slept with a blade beneath your pillow. You couldn't settle down. You couldn't afford to. One misstep, one person recognizing you in a bustling market, and your entire existence would transform into a desperate dash for the nearest sewer grate. Even fellow criminals maintained their distance. Thieves and smugglers were sociable, but you were the person who made others disappear. They feared you, or worse, saw you as a walking liability. No one wanted to share stew with someone whose profession could attract a torch-wielding mob. And don't expect sympathy. You couldn't confide in anyone about the difficulty of sleeping after silently strangling a corrupt bishop. If you discussed your job, people would assume you were either lying or dangerous, and they wouldn't be wrong. So you guarded your secrets, your scars, and your weapons alone. In inns, you'd sit in the darkest corner, back to the wall, eyes perpetually scanning the door. You never drank excessively. You never stayed longer than a single night. You didn't reveal your name unless someone paid you first, and even then, it probably wasn't your real one. Being a medieval assassin meant mastering the art of vanishing, not just from a crowd, but from every life you never got to live. Let's assume you accepted the job. You meticulously planned your route. You successfully bribed the right doorman. You even managed a highly convincing disguise as a chimney sweep. And then you froze. Perhaps the target unexpectedly turned around. Perhaps they were accompanied by their child. Or perhaps you suffered a sudden fit of tremors at the worst possible moment, and your knife hand quivered like a terrified squirrel. Guess what? You're now dead. Because failure for a medieval assassin wasn't a minor reprimand or a poor performance review. It resulted in a public, agonizing, and wildly theatrical death, often involving ropes, fire, wheels, or sharp iron contraptions with names like the Bone Cracker's Delight. Missing the kill meant jeopardizing the entire operation. Your target would survive and immediately inform everyone that an attempt had been made on their life. Suddenly, you were no longer a shadow. You were a wanted man, complete with a detailed description and likely a crude sketch affixed to every tavern wall within 30 miles. And those guards you once expertly bypassed, now they were highly motivated. Sometimes your concern wasn't even your target, but your client. If you failed, you transitioned from an asset to a liability, someone who could be tortured, interrogated, or worse, compelled to talk. The very individuals who hired you would be the first to issue a second contract on your head. And there were no second chances. No, sorry, the blade slipped. I'll try again tomorrow. You had one shot, one fleeting moment in time. And if you bungled it, the best you could hope for was a swift death before anyone discovered who commissioned you. Failure also brought with it a quiet, humiliating shame. You didn't just fail to kill, you failed to remain invisible, to be perfect. And for assassins, perfection was synonymous with survival. Anything less, and you might as well paint a target on your back and begin rehearsing your final words. It didn't matter how many successful jobs you'd completed previously. No one cared that you'd succeeded 12 times. Because in this profession, you are only as good as your last kill. And if your last kill didn't happen, you'd better start running. So you did it. The plan succeeded. The dagger found its mark. No screams, no guards, just a clean collapse to the floor and a very important person who was no longer important. Congratulations, now run for your life. Because being a successful medieval assassin didn't involve sipping wine on a rooftop while the city burned below you. It meant fleeing through back alleys with someone's blood on your boots and a dog already sniffing your trail. There was no victory lap, no celebratory drink with colleagues, no casual debriefing with your client. You didn't even get a moment to admire your work. The instant your blade struck, your new primary objective became escaping everyone who now wished to murder you in increasingly imaginative ways. Guards approaching, doors locked, horses stabled on the other side of town, and you, likely bleeding. You had to meticulously plan your escape before the assassination. Routes, disguises, fallback safe houses, perhaps a boatman who owed you a favor, or at least wouldn't ask inconvenient questions, because the city would enter lockdown within minutes. No one wanted a scandal, and lockdown meant closed gates, armed checkpoints, and a dozen enraged men with swords, all having received your rough sketch and the unsettling description, possibly armed and extremely stabby. And let's consider the client. Assuming they actually intended to pay you, they certainly wouldn't meet you at a cozy tavern with a smile and a thank you card. They'd likely vanish as well. Because an assassin who has just completed a job is the most dangerous person alive. You possessed too much knowledge. You had proven your ability to access places others couldn't. So even when you succeeded, you walked away with payment in one hand and a colossal target on your back. And what did you gain? A week of sleeping in grimy lofts, bribing ferry captains, shaving your beard in the dark, and pretending your name was Brother Lucian as you attempted to blend in with monks heading east. Because success didn't guarantee survival. It simply meant restarting the entire grim game in a new city, under a new alias, with even more people hunting you this time. So yes, you made the kill, now run like hell. If being a medieval assassin wasn't already miserable enough, impoverished, constantly hunted, and sleeping in places reeking of goat, you also had to contend with the wonderfully imaginative paranoia of those around you. Because in the Middle Ages, assassins weren't just feared, they were considered cursed. To the average peasant, you weren't merely a hooded killer, you were some unholy creature who whispered to demons and smeared frog guts on your blade under a full moon. Why else would you possess the ability to slip past guards and vanish into the darkness? Logic wasn't particularly prevalent back then, but superstition? Oh, that was ubiquitous. Some believed assassins could shapeshift. Others claimed you were invisible unless doused in holy water. A popular tale suggested assassins formed pacts with forest spirits and could exhale death through walls. Imagine walking through a village and overhearing a woman muttering, "Don't make eye contact. He might hex the baby." Even your tools were viewed with suspicion. Carrying a dagger? Clearly, it was forged in a cursed forge. Using poison? That wasn't chemistry, that was witchcraft, and you likely stirred it with a severed toe under a blood moon. You might assume this widespread fear would benefit you, making people avoid you, right? But the reality was far worse. Superstitious mobs don't hesitate. They don't ask questions. They throw stones, start fires, and yell things like, "Burn him before he calls lightning." Your reputation caused people to overreact. The instant someone died unexpectedly from illness, an accident, or choking on a chicken bone, someone would whisper, "Perhaps it was a shadow man. Perhaps it was him." You could be hunted simply for existing in the same village as a suspicious death. This meant you had to keep moving, perpetually. Linger too long, and suddenly a priest would be ringing a bell, while 5 angry farmers brandished pitchforks, as if they'd been waiting for this moment their entire lives. And heaven help you if you were apprehended with anything remotely unusual. Dried herbs, strange coins, or even a foreign accent. That's all it took for someone to scream "sorcerer" and light a torch. In a world that believed monsters wore human faces, being too quiet, too clever, or too swift made you a threat. And in medieval logic, threats had to die quickly, and preferably by fire. Ah, poison, the assassin's supposed weapon of elegance. A quiet kill, no mess, no screaming, just a sip, a stagger, a sigh, and done. That's the theory. In practice, attempting to poison someone in the Middle Ages was akin to trying to win a bar fight with herbal tea and a poor attitude. Firstly, poisons were unreliable. You didn't have access to purified cyanide or a convenient little pill labeled fast-acting doom. You had plants, mushrooms, minerals, perhaps the occasional toad. You had to gather, grind, and then pray. And even then, it might only give the target a stomachache and a renewed dedication to his anti-assassin guard team. There was no scientific measurement. You didn't precisely dose, you eyeballed it. A pinch too little, and the noble would merely vomit and cancel dinner. A pinch too much, and you might succumb to exposure before the first course was served. Furthermore, medieval kitchens were chaotic. You couldn't simply waltz in and season the soup with nightshade. You had to bribe or impersonate a cook, sneak in unnoticed, or worst of all, attempt to poison a meal that would pass through 3 tasters and a dog. Yes, a dog. And if your victim was a noble, they didn't merely consume food, they treated it like a military operation. Meals were tasted, blessed, and sniffed by everyone from the steward to the jester. By the time the food reached their plate, it had undergone more security checks than a royal wedding. Even assuming you succeeded, you slipped in the poison, it went undetected, and the target actually consumed it. The subsequent events were wildly unpredictable. Some poisons took hours, some took days. One moment, your mark might be laughing at a joke. The next, he'd be clutching his stomach and demanding to consult his astrologer. And if they survived, guess who would be blamed? Not the cook, not the taster. You, the quiet person with herbal knowledge and twitchy eyes. So poisoning wasn't efficient. It was risky, slow, and rife with variables, none of them in your favor. And if you were caught, you wouldn't face a swift death. You'd be interrogated with various tools until you confessed to poisoning everyone from the duke to the dog. You'd think that if you successfully altered the course of history by removing a tyrant, sabotaging a royal bloodline, or silencing a political threat, someone would remember your name. Nope, you were an assassin. That meant your name was never intended to be remembered. At best, you were a rumor, some hooded figure, a mysterious foreigner with cold eyes, or the quiet individual who never finished his ale. You might have pulled off the most legendary hit of the century, and still ended up as a mysterious death in the official record. In fact, that was the entire point. Your client didn't want a story. They wanted plausible deniability. The fewer people who knew who committed the act, the safer they were, and the less likely they were to end up poisoned by their own assassin. So your name was buried the moment the job was complete, assuming you even used a real one. You didn't sign your work, you didn't boast, you didn't keep trophies. You ceased to exist outside the precise moment of the kill. And if someone did know your name, that was a loose end. And in your profession, loose ends had a very short lifespan. And forget about honor. There were no medals for silence, no stone monuments for the person who stopped a war with a single dagger in the night. If a noble desired a statue, they commissioned one for themselves. You'd get a wooden box, an unmarked grave, or, if things went particularly awry, a head on a spike labeled traitor. Sometimes your name was known only so it could be cursed. You'd become a whispered warning. Don't cross the king. Remember what happened to Lord Ulrich? Yes. And the man who did it? Gone, like a ghost. That was your legacy. Not fame, not fear, just absence. You weren't supposed to leave a mark, you were supposed to vanish. And if you lingered long enough to be known, that was a fatal error. Because in the medieval world, heroes were remembered. Assassins were erased. So, you survived. You completed the task. You even managed to get paid. A miracle in itself. Now all you had to do was lay low, keep your head down, and trust that your client would honor the agreement and protect your identity. Right? Wrong. Because in the realm of medieval assassination, there was one rule even more sacred than don't get caught. Never trust anyone, especially the person paying you. Your client, whether a noble, a merchant, or a bishop with ambition and very loose morals, didn't hire you out of respect. They hired you because they needed something dreadful done, and you were the sharpest tool operating in the shadows. Once the job was complete, you instantly became a liability. You knew too much. You knew who wanted whom dead, when, why, and potentially how much they were willing to pay for it. That made you dangerous, not just to their enemies, but to them. So what did they do? They disavowed you. They denied ever having met you. Or worse, They dispatched someone else to eliminate you, to definitively close the contract with something sharper than ink. There were even instances where clients double-booked, hiring one assassin for the job and another to immediately kill the first one afterwards. No refunds, just reduced risk. And if you dared attempt to blackmail a client, to threaten exposure, that was a bold move. And also your final mistake. Because powerful individuals in the Middle Ages didn't negotiate with assassins, they crushed them. If your client possessed a shred of honor, a truly rare characteristic, you might get paid and left alone. But even then, you'd still have to assume they were observing you from a distance, with someone already sharpening steel and memorizing your gait. You were the secret that couldn't speak, the shadow that couldn't linger. Even success wasn't enough to earn trust, because in their eyes, if you killed once, you were capable of killing again. And no one, not even the person who hired you, wanted to be next. Let's imagine somehow you defied the odds. You survived the assassinations, the deceptions, the poisonings, the betrayals. You outlived your enemies, your employers, and probably your own moral compass. Now what? Do you retire? Absolutely not. Because in medieval times, assassins didn't have retirement plans. There were no farewell banquets, no tranquil cottages by the sea, no pensions paid in gold coins and grateful whispers. You didn't fade into a peaceful existence. You vanished or you died, often both. The problem was straightforward. You were never truly safe. Even if you walked away from the profession, your past wouldn't. You carried too many secrets in your mind, too many names in your memory, and too much blood on your hands. People didn't want you retired. They wanted you forgotten, which typically meant buried. And even if no one actively pursued you, and that's a significant if, you had to live with the constant dread that someone might. That a new assassin, young and eager to prove themselves, had just received a contract for a shadowy figure who used to be someone dangerous. So you'd change your name again. You'd move to a village where questions were rarely asked. You'd feign a limp, sell herbs, pretend you once served as a guard. But even then, restful sleep eluded you. You avoided crowds. You always sat facing the door. You kept your dagger hidden beneath the floorboard, next to the pouch of coins you never touched, because it still smelled of the person from whom you earned them. And you couldn't even trust yourself. Years of silent killings and swift escapes did something profound to your psyche. Every knock on the door made you flinch. Every stranger on the road might recognize you. You stopped dreaming because dreaming was dangerous. You couldn't love. You couldn't relax. You couldn't laugh too loudly. You existed as a ghost pretending to be a man. The truth was, there was no favorable endgame for a medieval assassin, just a slow, cold descent into obscurity, perpetually moving, perpetually vigilant, until one day you slipped into the darkness and no one even noticed. And perhaps that was the best outcome one could hope for. By now, you've likely grasped the reality. Being a medieval assassin wasn't darkly romantic. It wasn't noble. It wasn't even particularly profitable. It was a grim, thankless, and short-lived profession, cloaked in blood-stained linen and constantly pursued by individuals who wished you dead. You wouldn't last. Not a week, perhaps not even a day. Because you'd start with flawed assumptions, that you'd be sleek, in control, a mere whisper in the dark. But in reality, you'd be cold, hungry, and one bad guess away from the gallows. You'd slip into town, cloak drawn tight, ready for action, only to discover that your target had relocated. The guards were inebriated but quick to react. And the stable boy you paid for information had just sold you out for a mug of ale and a piece of bread. You'd freeze at the critical moment, stab the wrong person, or be spotted by someone's maid who had once seen your face near the chapel. And suddenly, you're not a shadow, you're the problem. Then what? You run. But you're unaccustomed to medieval terrain. The pervasive mud, the uneven cobblestones, the absolutely astonishing number of loose chickens in the street. You'd slip, fall, and be tackled by a guard named Thomas, who just experienced a breakup and was looking for an outlet. And let's say you survive that. Then you contend with the aftermath. No allies, no honor, and no future. Just whispers, pervasive suspicion, and the growing realization that even if you succeed, the best you can hope for is to die old and alone, concealed behind a false name in a village that still believed in fairies. So no, you wouldn't last. And frankly, you shouldn't even attempt it. Because the assassin's life wasn't glamorous, it was a cruel machine that consumed individuals and produced nothing but shadows. It offered power without peace and purpose without a place in the world. You didn't make history, you erased yourself from it. And the only thing awaiting you at the end was silence. A silence no one would question, because no one even remembered you were there in the first place. Before she was the feared queen of Macedonia, Olympias was known as Myrtle, a Molossian princess from the rugged tribal lands of Epirus. Her people claimed direct descent from the legendary Achilles, and regardless of whether the blood of heroes truly coursed through her veins, one thing was undeniable. This was not a woman destined for the fringes of history. From a young age, Myrtle was steeped in an aura of mystery and ritual. Her upbringing was shaped not solely by politics but by prophecy, ecstatic rites, and a profound reverence for the ancient gods. She wasn't the type of princess who merely smiled and embroidered tapestries. Instead, she was drawn to serpents, omens, and the frenzied ceremonies of the cult of Dionysus, where women danced barefoot in the moonlight, summoning the divine in states of trance. Her connection to the gods was not a performance, it was deeply personal. She didn't merely worship, she embodied the divine. According to ancient sources, likely penned by men who were both terrified and captivated by her, she kept sacred snakes in her chambers and even allowed them to coil beside her in bed. Whether this was literal truth or the kind of sensationalized slander that powerful women often attract, we'll never truly know. But the image endured. To her allies, it made her divine. To her enemies, it made her dangerous. Her true power began not on a battlefield or in a throne room, but in the unsettling flicker of torchlight, amidst the whispers of priestesses and the sinuous movements of serpents. She wasn't just a princess. She was a living oracle, a woman touched by something older than politics and colder than steel. So when Philip II of Macedon, a brutal, brilliant, and famously promiscuous ruler, arrived at the island of Samothrace for a religious initiation, he didn't just encounter a beautiful princess. He encountered a mystery he couldn't resist. Their marriage was not merely a political alliance. It was a collision of prophecy and power, and from its very inception, it was laden with omens. Some accounts claim lightning illuminated the sky on their wedding night. Others asserted that Olympias dreamed of a thunderbolt entering her womb. All of it would eventually become legend. But one fact is certain: the union of Olympias and Philip didn't just produce a child, it produced Alexander the Great, and she intended to shape his destiny from his very first breath. Olympias' marriage to Philip II was far from the fairy tale one might expect for a queen who would one day give birth to an empire. From the outset, it was a volatile blend of prophecy, pride, and paranoia. Philip, ruthless, charismatic, and already accumulating wives like trophies, married Olympias around 357 BCE. She was likely just a teenager, but she was far from naive. She recognized in Philip a man whose ambition mirrored her own, and perhaps even a divine partner for her spiritual destiny. Macedon was hardly an easy kingdom to enter. It was a land of iron and unbridled ambition, where kings were murdered by their cousins and brothers transformed into rivals overnight. But Olympias, the priestess of Epirus, entered with her head held high, her eyes already fixed on the crown. Their marriage was troubled from the start. Philip, for all his political genius, was not inclined towards monogamy. He would proceed to marry multiple women, often for strategic alliances, always for power. But Olympias was not one to passively recede into the shadows. She maintained her own court, nurtured her own alliances, and was known to consult oracles and perform rites to divine her future, and perhaps Philip's fate. Then came the birth of Alexander. Even that event was shrouded in celestial drama. Legends recount Olympias dreaming that a thunderbolt struck her womb, and that flames danced around her child without harming him. Philip reportedly experienced a vision of sealing his wife's womb with a lion. Yes, a literal lion. Whether they genuinely believed these visions or deliberately invented them, they certainly behaved as if Alexander was destined to rule not merely a kingdom, but the entire world. But even as the child was celebrated, the fissures in the royal marriage deepened. Olympias resented Philip's other wives, particularly his Macedonian bride, Cleopatra Eurydice, whom he married later in life. This was more than a mere domestic dispute. It was a profound threat. Cleopatra was Macedonian-born, and any son she bore would be considered purer in the eyes of the local nobility, a direct challenge to Alexander's future. Olympias perceived the danger clearly. The palace was not simply a home, it was a battlefield, and she would employ every snake, dream, ritual, and whispered rumor she possessed to ensure her son was not just remembered, but crowned. She was no longer Myrtle. She was Olympias now, and no one would usurp her son's throne without first facing her wrath. By the time Alexander reached adolescence, the Macedonian palace in Pella had transformed into a war zone of thinly veiled insults, calculated political maneuvering, and bitter rivalries. Olympias wasn't merely vying for influence, she was fighting for her very survival. She understood that the court teemed with snakes, but she was the one who had taught them how to bite. Philip II had begun to distance himself from her. He was campaigning more frequently, drinking more heavily, and perhaps most dangerously, increasingly listening to his Macedonian advisors. The final blow came when he married a young noblewoman named Cleopatra Eurydice, not to be confused with the Cleopatra of Egypt. This Cleopatra was Macedonian-born, and her uncle Attalus was one of Philip's most trusted generals. To Olympias, it wasn't just betrayal, it was an open declaration of war. The marriage ceremony itself was a disaster. At the subsequent feast, Attalus drunkenly insulted Olympias and Alexander, casting doubt on the legitimacy of Alexander's birth. Was he truly Philip's son, or was he, as Olympias often claimed, the child of a god? It was intended as an insult, but Olympias shrewdly embraced the myth. Let them whisper. Let them believe her son was touched by Zeus. It rendered him untouchable. Alexander stormed out of the feast. Olympias completely abandoned Macedon, retreating to Epirus. But her exile was not a defeat. It was a strategic withdrawal. In her homeland, she remained royalty. She could gather support, discreetly influence ears, and observe as Philip's palace began to crumble from within. She didn't need to be physically present to be dangerous. Then came the seismic shock. Philip was assassinated at his daughter's wedding, just as he was poised to invade Persia, on the very precipice of crowning himself not only king of Macedon, but potential emperor of the known world. The question that reverberated through every marble corridor and torch-lit hall was universal. Who was responsible? Was it Pausanias, the jilted bodyguard who carried out the act? Was it the culmination of court intrigue? Was it Alexander himself? Or, whisper it softly, was it Olympias? No one could definitively prove it. No one dared, but many believed it. After all, within days, Cleopatra Eurydice and her newborn child were dead, murdered, some claim, by Olympias herself. The serpent had indeed returned to the palace, and now nothing stood between her son and the throne. With Philip dead and Macedon plunged into mourning, or perhaps confusion, Olympias made her move. While others scrambled to comprehend the chaos, she acted, swiftly, brutally, decisively. First, Cleopatra Eurydice, the young Macedonian queen and rival wife, was eliminated. According to chilling accounts, Olympias didn't simply have her killed. She orchestrated her death to be symbolic, public, and humiliating. Some say Cleopatra was forced to hang herself after witnessing the murder of her infant daughter. Others claim Olympias had the child cast onto a funeral pyre. What is universally agreed upon is this: no mercy was shown. Olympias understood what many mothers in ancient courts refused to accept. In a royal palace, mercy is a fatal weakness. A rival child, no matter how young, represented a future conflict. And Olympias was done playing defense. With Cleopatra and her bloodline eradicated, she could then focus on securing Alexander's throne. Her teenage son, bold, brilliant, and already tutored by Aristotle, was declared king without significant opposition. But make no mistake, it wasn't solely his charisma or his father's legacy that made this possible. It was Olympias. She knew which generals to threaten, which nobles to flatter, and which enemies to discreetly remove. She wasn't merely safeguarding her son's ascent, she was meticulously engineering it. Alexander himself didn't always approve. He reportedly disapproved of the violence against Cleopatra's family, but he also didn't intervene to stop it, because deep down he understood what Olympias had always known. Power demands bloodshed, and in Macedon, bloodlines were both a blessing and a curse. With her son now king, Olympias began to withdraw slightly from public life. But this was no retirement. She simply shifted from overt strikes to subtle influence. As Alexander prepared to launch his conquest of Persia, she remained behind, not as a passive queen mother, but as the spiritual guardian of his destiny. She dispatched sacred relics to him, consulted oracles, and performed rituals on his behalf. To Olympias, her son's mission wasn't just military, it was divine. Alexander wasn't merely going to war, he was fulfilling prophecy, and as long as she drew breath, no rival, Macedonian, Persian, or otherwise, would derail that divine plan. She had crowned her son, she had purified the palace. Now she would protect his empire from behind the scenes, with teeth bared. As Alexander marched east to conquer the known world, Olympias remained in Macedon, a queen without a throne, yet undeniably powerful. Her official title was Queen Mother, but make no mistake, she governed in all but name. Though the regency was technically entrusted to Antipater, one of Alexander's trusted generals, Olympias refused to be marginalized. She wrote letters to her son constantly, offering advice, issuing warnings, and sometimes chastising him. These weren't the tender letters of a doting mother. They were political briefings, interwoven with oracles and venom. And Alexander, thousands of miles away, meticulously read every word. She reminded him of his true enemies. She questioned the loyalty of his companions. She criticized his growing fascination with Persian customs, his choice of wives, and his audacious flirtation with claiming divinity. No one else dared utter these criticisms to him, but Olympias was never afraid to speak as a mother or as a priestess of divine will. Back in Macedon, Antipater grew increasingly resentful. Olympias undermined him at every opportunity. She leveraged her status, her religious authority, and her family ties to instigate opposition against him. She held significant influence in Epirus, in Thessaly, and among the aristocracy. She could spread rumors like wildfire, and with Olympias, a whisper could be more lethal than a sword. Meanwhile, her letters to Alexander became more urgent. She warned him of Antipater's ambition, portraying him as a second Philip, poised for betrayal and usurpation. Whether she genuinely believed this, or simply feared losing her grip on power, she continued to pressure her son to act. Alexander, however, hesitated. He needed Antipater to maintain order in Greece while he fought in Asia. And so the chasm between mother and general widened. Olympias watched, she waited, but beneath her religious robes and maternal concern, she was growing impatient. She hadn't endured years of palace warfare, only to be governed by an aging soldier. As Alexander's empire expanded from the Aegean to India, Olympias detected vulnerabilities. He was attempting too much, trusting too many foreign advisors, and drifting away from the mother and the gods who had elevated him. She believed his victories stemmed from divine favor and from her own influence. And if he forgot that, well, Olympias knew how to remind kings of their true origins, even if that king was her own son. When news of Alexander's death in Babylon reached Macedon in 323 BCE, it didn't arrive with a triumphant trumpet call. It arrived like a sudden dagger. For Olympias, it wasn't merely the loss of a son. It was the collapse of the entire world she had meticulously constructed over decades. Her boy, the divine storm she had prophesied, nurtured, and unleashed, was gone. And he had left behind no clear heir, no single successor, only utter chaos. The mighty empire he had carved out was already fracturing. His generals, his so-called successors, were already carving it up like jackals circling a carcass. Antipater still held sway in Macedon and Greece, and he harbored no affection for Olympias. Worse, her daughter Cleopatra, Alexander's sister, was being pursued by rival generals for marriage, each hoping to leverage her bloodline as a claim to the throne. Olympias foresaw the inevitable. Civil war was not a possibility, it was a certainty, and once again she would be compelled to act. But she no longer had Alexander. What she possessed instead was his bloodline. His young son, Alexander IV, born to Roxana, the Bactrian princess Alexander had married. Roxana, still in Macedon, was vulnerable. The boy was even more so. Olympias recognized that the infant was now the last true piece of her son's legacy, making him both a target and a potent weapon. She allied herself with Roxana and the child, determined to protect them and utilize the boy's birthright to assert her own claim in the political arena. But the tide was turning. The generals who had once bowed before Alexander had no interest in kneeling to his widow or his mother. They now commanded armies, harbored their own ambitions, and held grudges. Olympias did not flinch. She had confronted snakes, traitors, and kings. A few warlords with crowns and pilfered spears would not intimidate her, so she plotted. She waited. She watched as Antipater died and was succeeded by his son, Cassander, a man with ice in his veins and no tolerance for the old queen's machinations. It was only a matter of time before these two forces collided, the serpent mother of Alexander and the cold-eyed usurper who desired her demise. Alexander was gone, but his shadow still loomed, and Olympias was still coiled within it, poised to strike. Years after Alexander's death, as his sprawling empire fractured into civil war, Olympias executed her most audacious move yet. She returned to Macedon, not as a grieving mother, but as a political force embodying divine fury. The regency had splintered. Cassander, the son of her old adversary Antipater, was seizing power, and Roxana, along with young Alexander IV, was effectively imprisoned. Olympias recognized the impending danger. If she didn't act immediately, her grandson would vanish like a shadow at dusk. So she forged an alliance with Polyperchon, an aging general who still possessed a flicker of legitimate authority. Olympias would return not to supplicate but to rule. With Polyperchon's support, she entered Macedon at the head of an army. And the moment her feet touched her homeland, everything transformed. Towns opened their gates, soldiers defected to her side, even some of her old enemies hesitated. Olympias, despite her age, was still a name that made the very ground tremble. Then came her vengeance. One by one, she hunted down Cassander's loyalists. And when she finally captured Philip III Aridaeus, Alexander's mentally impaired half-brother and puppet king, she ordered his execution. According to some sources, his wife, Eurydice, was apprehended and offered the chance to take her own life. When she refused, Olympias had her strangled. It was brutality veiled in royal protocol, and Olympias, ever the theatrical figure, staged the scene as a goddess delivering divine justice. Her message was unequivocal. Only Alexander's bloodline possessed the right to rule. Everyone else was a pretender. For a brief burning moment, Olympias held the kingdom firmly in her grasp. She had restored the dynasty. She had avenged betrayals. She had reminded Macedon what royal power looked like when wielded by a woman with nothing left to lose. But power in Macedon was like fire in dry grass, and Cassander was still at large, calculating, biding his time. He returned with a vengeance. His army outnumbered hers, his resources were greater, and his cruelty colder. Her allies began to desert her. Polyperchon's influence waned, the tide had turned. Olympias, now isolated within the fortress of Pydna, watched as her enemies closed in. She had lit the match, Macedon had burned, and now the smoke was thick with her enemies at the gates. Olympias, once the most feared woman in the ancient world, now found herself besieged in the coastal fortress of Pydna, alone, cut off, surrounded by the army of Cassander, who had come to complete what his father had started. But Olympias did not beg, she did not plead. For nearly a year, she endured the siege like a statue sculpted from divine wrath. Food dwindled, disease began to spread, allies vanished. Yet within the fortress walls, she maintained the same unwavering presence that had once intimidated kings. To the very end, she carried herself not as a prisoner, but as the mother of a god. Cassander, always cautious, hesitated. He knew that killing Olympias was dangerous. Even now, she was enveloped by a myth-like armor. She was still the mother of Alexander the Great. To strike her down might be perceived as blasphemy. So he offered her safety. Surrender, he stated, and her life would be spared. Olympias knew better. She had witnessed too many royal promises turn to ash. Still, hunger was no longer just in discomfort. It was a harbinger of death. Her garrison broke, her followers surrendered, and Olympias, unyielding until the very end, was finally handed over to her enemies. Cassander did not execute her himself. That would have been too simple, too merciful. Instead, he delivered her to the families of those she had executed during her brief return to power. Let them decide her fate. They condemned her to death. But here's the peculiar twist. When the executioners arrived, no one dared strike the first blow. Olympias stood tall, regal, and silent, her eyes fixed on them like an oracle gazing through smoke. These were Macedonians. They had grown up hearing tales of her rituals, her visions, her snakes. They had once cheered her son as a living god. And now here she stood, a frail old woman cloaked in myth. and not a single man possessed the courage to swing the sword. So Cassander dispatched others, foreigners, outsiders, people who held no memory of her power, only orders to fulfill. And thus Olympias was finally struck down, not with ceremony, not with dignity, but with silence. Her death marked the definitive end of Alexander's bloodline in any meaningful position of power. And with it, the final ember of an empire founded on divine ambition was extinguished. But even in death, Olympias left behind a profound shadow, and history would never forget the Serpent Queen. Olympias died not on a throne, but in the dust, unarmed, abandoned, and executed by the very people she once commanded. But history operates in curious ways. It doesn't always favor those who die peacefully in silk sheets. Sometimes it remembers those who went down hissing, and Olympias was never destined for quiet obscurity. In life, she had wielded motherhood like a sword and prophecy like a shield. She wasn't merely the mother of Alexander the Great. She was one of the architects of his ascent. Without her, there would be no myth of the divine child, no whispered rituals of thunderbolts and lions, no ruthless purging of rivals that cleared the path for a teenage king to rule the known world. Olympias didn't just give birth to an empire. She defended it with ferocity. Yet even among the ancient world's most ruthless dynasts, Olympias stands uniquely apart. She didn't lead armies in the field like Cleopatra or charge into battle like Boudica. Her battlefield was more subtle and colder. It was a world of poisoned goblets, strategic political marriages, priestesses, and oracles. She understood the power of fear, and even more significantly, she understood the power of belief. She made people believe her son was divine, and she may have even believed it herself. Her enemies branded her a murderer, a witch, a manipulator, and they weren't entirely wrong. Olympias embodied all those traits and more. She was a product of a brutal world that valued cunning far more than kindness, and she learned early that mercy was a luxury queens could ill afford. In the centuries that followed, she was simultaneously vilified and mythologized. Some labeled her a villain, others a visionary, but no historian, ancient or modern, could dismiss her as irrelevant. She haunted Alexander's legacy like a phantom, always in the background, always just behind the curtain, and perhaps that's precisely where she belonged. Not as a tragic mother or a footnote in a king's story, but as a compelling narrative all her own. The woman who cloaked herself in prophecy, shared her bed with snakes, and outlived gods. Olympias's bones turned to dust long ago, but her legend persists in every tale of ruthless queens, in every whisper of blood-borne destiny, in every empire constructed on myth. She is still there, coiled in the dark, patiently waiting. On the sun-bleached island of Crete, merely a few miles south of the modern city of Heraklion, lies a ruin that feels more like an ethereal dream than a tangible place. Stone corridors meander in every direction. Rooms twist and double back. Staircases ascend to nowhere. Even today, it's easy to lose your bearings. This place is Knossos, the vibrant heart of Minoan civilization, and the supposed inspiration for one of the most enduring myths in human history, the labyrinth of the Minotaur. But before there was a legend, there was a magnificent palace, a palace unlike any other. Constructed around 1900 BCE and expanded over centuries, Knossos wasn't merely a royal residence. It was an entire city contained under one roof. Spanning nearly 150,000 square feet, it boasted over 1,000 rooms, light wells, vast storage magazines, shrines, workshops, and what may have been history's first flushing toilets. It featured running water, multi-story apartments, and an intricate air circulation system. This was no primitive fortress. It was an architectural marvel. To modern archaeologists, Knossos appears as organized chaos. To ancient visitors, it likely felt like pure magic. The individual who brought Knossos to modern prominence was British archaeologist Arthur Evans. In the early 1900s, Evans excavated the site and quickly became convinced that this was indeed the origin of the Greek labyrinth myth. The layout was disorienting, the architecture profoundly symbolic, and everywhere he turned he discovered motifs of bulls, painted on walls, carved into stone, or sculpted into tiny golden charms. The bull, after all, was sacred to the Minoans. Evans even went so far as to name the civilization after the mythical King Minos. Whether Minos was a historical figure or not, his legend became inextricably linked with the ruins. But here's the twist. No literal labyrinth has ever been found. No underground maze, no prison chambers, no half-man monster. What we have instead is something far more enigmatic, a city designed in loops, wings, and layers, deliberately challenging to navigate. And the deeper one delves, the more the boundaries between history and mythology blur. So the question persists. Was the Minotaur born from these very walls, or was the palace itself the monster? Knossos may not surrender its answers easily, but it excels at prompting the right questions. The myth is as renowned as the ruin, a monstrous half-man, half-bull confined within a labyrinth so intricate that no one who entered ever found their escape. Only Theseus, the Athenian hero, managed to slay the beast and emerge, aided by a ball of thread and the cleverness of Princess Ariadne. But what was the origin of this story, and why specifically a labyrinth? The earliest versions of the myth recount King Minos, the powerful ruler of Crete, demanding an annual tribute from Athens of 7 boys and 7 girls. These unfortunate souls were offered to the Minotaur, a creature born from divine punishment and profound shame. The Minotaur, imprisoned in an underground maze, symbolized the dark underbelly of power, something savage concealed behind grandeur. To ancient Greeks, Crete had long been a land of immense wealth, profound mystery, and palpable fear. Its seafaring inhabitants, the Minoans, were perceived as both elegant and strangely alien. Their rituals involved daring bull leaping, their artwork depicted unfamiliar gods, and their palaces were unlike anything seen on the mainland. To a Greek visitor from 1000 BCE, Knossos might have felt like a completely different world. The bull itself held sacred significance in Minoan culture. Frescoes vividly portray young men and women vaulting over charging bulls in ritualistic displays. Horns of consecration, stylized bull horns, adorned rooftops and altars. Combine this with a palace that feels like a maze, and the ingredients for a legend begin to coalesce. But what if the Minotaur wasn't merely a monster? What if it was a metaphor? Some scholars propose that the tale reflects a historical memory of Cretan dominance over the Aegean, a period when Athens genuinely paid tribute to a stronger, more enigmatic power. The labyrinth could symbolize the political subjugation of weaker states, and the Minotaur, the raw, terrifying force underpinning Minoan rule. Others argue for a more psychological interpretation, the labyrinth as the unconscious mind, the Minotaur as our hidden primal urges, and Theseus, the hero bravely venturing into the darkness, guided only by the thread of memory. Still, the myth remains inextricably linked with Knossos. The palace is the closest tangible artifact we've ever found to a real labyrinth. No monster, no Ariadne, but perhaps something far deeper. Not just a myth echoing through history, but a history that yearned to become myth. Long before Athens erected its majestic marble temples or Sparta sharpened its fearsome spears, there existed the Minoan civilization, one of the earliest advanced societies in Europe. They exercised power not through military conquest, but through extensive trade, exquisite art, and what appears to be an almost supernatural mastery of architecture. At the core of their influence stood Knossos, a palace that was far more than a royal residence. It served as a vital hub of culture, ritual, and economic activity. The Minoans flourished from approximately 2600 to 1400 BCE. Based on the island of Crete, they developed a vast trade network that stretched to Egypt, Mesopotamia, the Levant, and even the distant shores of Spain. Their ships glided through the Mediterranean like silent arrows, transporting pottery, saffron, bronze, and luxurious goods. They didn't build colossal armies, instead they forged relationships. And this, more than any weapon, brought them immense wealth. What is most striking about Minoan culture is its distinctiveness from their later Greek successors. Their artwork celebrated nature, animals, and graceful human movement, rather than focusing on war or divine punishment. Frescoes depict dancers, playful dolphins, and athletes vaulting over powerful bulls. Even their goddesses appear different, formidable, bare-breasted figures, often holding snakes, symbols perhaps of fertility, transformation, or protection. At the center of it all was Knossos, not a fortified stronghold on a hill, but a sprawling complex situated in a fertile valley. It lacked massive defensive walls, suggesting the Minoans either felt secure on their island or projected sufficient power to render such defenses unnecessary. Their confidence was embodied in their architecture. Multi-story buildings, colonnaded courtyards, and advanced plumbing systems hinted at a society far ahead of its time. And yet, despite all their sophistication, the Minoans left behind no deciphered written records. Their primary script, Linear A, remains unreadable to this day. We don't know what they called themselves. We don't know the beliefs of their kings, the prayers they uttered, or what truly transpired behind the enigmatic walls of Knossos. All that remains are their ruins, their art, and their enduring influence, which was later absorbed by the Mycenaeans and echoed in Greek myths. The Minoans were not merely builders of palaces, they were architects of mystery. And Knossos was not just a building. It was the pulsating heart of a civilization that shimmered briefly, like sunlight dancing on the Aegean Sea, and then vanished. But some say their echo still roams the maze. To walk through Knossos is to embark on a journey through time, a layered, perplexing, yet beautiful expanse of time. It's not just the sheer scale that overpowers you, it's the intricate design. Rooms lead into other rooms, corridors diverge and abruptly end, light wells slice through the very core of the edifice, staircases spiral into impenetrable shadows or unexpectedly emerge into sunlit courtyards. Nothing follows a straight line. It's not difficult to understand why ancient visitors might have whispered the word labyrinth. Knossos wasn't just a palace, it was a living, breathing organism. Spanning an estimated 150,000 square feet, the complex housed over 1,000 chambers, some tiny, some magnificent. These weren't randomly placed rooms, they were meticulously designed workshops, vast storage areas, sacred shrines, apartments, and grand throne rooms, all arranged around a large central courtyard that may have hosted public ceremonies or daring bull-leaping rituals. The palace was constructed on multiple levels, reaching up to 4 or 5 stories in some sections, utilizing natural slopes and artificial terraces. To navigate it without getting lost, you would require a sharp memory, keen instinct, or a guiding thread like Theseus. And yet, this apparent chaos conceals a remarkable intelligence. The Minoans mastered passive ventilation, cooling rooms through clever air shafts and open stairwells. They channeled rainwater through sophisticated clay pipes and even possessed toilets that flushed long before Rome popularized the concept. One of the most iconic areas is the so-called throne room, named for the alabaster chair built into the wall, flanked by benches. Around it are frescoes depicting griffins, mythical guardians. Was this the seat of a priest-king, a goddess's private chamber, or a sacred court? No one knows for certain. And the walls, they speak in vibrant color. Vivid frescoes showcase dolphins swimming above bathtubs, women in elegant flounced skirts with bare chests, and youths gracefully leaping over bulls mid-air. The art wasn't merely decorative, it conveyed identity, fluid, natural, and deeply connected to the earth and sea. Still, the deeper you venture, the more Knossos begins to disorient. Some sections seem intentionally complex, as if designed to confuse. Perhaps that's the true origin of the labyrinth legend. Not a prison for monsters, but a palace that felt alive. A building that evoked awe, invited ritual, and held just a hint of fear. No locked doors, no mythical beasts, just a place constructed to make you question your location and what awaited around the next corner. Knossos wasn't just an administrative center or royal residence. It was a place of profound worship, an architectural embodiment of the Minoan soul, deeply imbued with ritual, myth, and divine mystery. Unlike later Greek temples, there are no towering columns dedicated to Zeus or grand marble shrines to Athena. Instead, the spiritual world of Knossos is more subtle, intricately woven into the very fabric of the building itself. Shrines are concealed in corners, pillars ascend like sacred sentinels. Horns, stylized, carved, symbolic, appear on rooftops and altars. Everywhere you look, the bull motif predominates, suggesting a powerful connection between worship, the natural world, and this revered animal. The Minoans didn't seem to fear the bull, they celebrated it. The famous bull-leaping fresco in Knossos is more than just athletic art. It may depict a profound religious rite. Young men and women vaulting over a charging bull, locked in a dance of danger and grace. It wasn't merely sport, it was sacred theater, possibly an offering to the gods or a symbolic triumph over chaos. Then there are the snake goddesses. Discovered in storerooms beneath the palace, These figurines are among the most iconic Minoan artifacts. Bare-breasted, arms raised, with serpents coiled in their hands or around their bodies, these figures radiate power. They are not submissive idols. They are formidable guardians of the household, of fertility, and perhaps of life itself. To the Minoans, snakes symbolized renewal, rebirth, and mystery, creatures belonging to both earth and the underworld. The rooms where these objects were found hint at household shrines or ritual spaces, quiet sacred corners nestled within the palace's bustling heart. Combined with the frescoes, the horns, the altars, and the labyrinthine corridors, the entire complex begins to feel like a ritual machine, a structure built not just for living, but for connecting with the divine. There is no centralized temple at Knossos because the palace itself functioned as a temple. Its layout, art, and design were all integral to a spiritual worldview where the boundaries between the sacred and the secular simply did not exist. This was a place where myth was architectural, where a corridor could become a passage to the gods, and where every echo in the stone chambers may have once been a whispered prayer. Knossos didn't just house people, it housed gods. For centuries, Knossos stood as a beacon of prosperity, innovation, and cultural sophistication. But then, something occurred, something sudden, something no one can fully explain. By approximately 1400 BCE, the palace was abandoned, its frescoes left to fade, and the once mighty Minoan civilization that had commanded the seas vanished like mist over the Aegean. So, what transpired? Theories abound. Some point to natural disasters. Around 1600 BCE, the volcanic island of Thera, modern-day Santorini, experienced one of the largest eruptions in human history. The colossal blast likely triggered tsunamis that battered Crete's northern coast, devastating ports and agricultural lands. Ash clouds may have obscured the sun, suffocating crops and disrupting the climate. While Knossos wasn't immediately destroyed, the aftermath of the eruption may have significantly weakened its foundations, economically, politically, and spiritually. Others looked to warfare. By 1450 BCE, the burgeoning power of the Mycenaeans, mainland Greeks, may have exploited Minoan vulnerabilities. Archaeological evidence suggests Knossos was briefly reoccupied, but the culture had undergone a profound transformation. The art became more martial. Linear A, the Minoan script, was superseded by Linear B, used by Mycenaean scribes. The palace that once thrived with snake goddesses and bull dancers now echoed in a foreign tongue. Some scholars believe the Mycenaeans didn't invade in a single overwhelming conquest, but rather gradually absorbed the island, first through trade, then through cultural influence, and finally through direct rule. Others contend that internal collapse, a civil uprising, political instability, or the failure of the elite may have contributed just as much to its demise. What is striking, however, is the scarcity of violence evident in the ruins. There are no charred skeletons, no widespread signs of mass slaughter. Knossos didn't fall with a scream, it faded with a whisper. The grand palatial system simply ceased to function. The rooms fell silent, the rituals ended, and nature slowly reclaimed the site. By the time Homer sang of Crete in his epics, Knossos was already an ancient myth, a memory entwined with stories of kings, monsters, and labyrinths. And perhaps that's fitting, because what ultimately extinguished Knossos wasn't just a volcanic eruption or an invasion. It was time, and the inevitable way all great things, no matter how beautiful, eventually succumb beneath the weight of new empires. But the bones of the palace remain, and if you listen closely, the maze still hums beneath the earth. For thousands of years, Knossos lay buried beneath the Cretan soil, merely another forgotten mound of stone lost to the annals of time. Its name was erased from memory, its myths distorted, its once magnificent walls swallowed by olive groves and dust. That is, until one man resolved to pursue a legend. His name was Sir Arthur Evans, and he didn't merely rediscover Knossos, he dramatically reimagined it. In 1900, Evans, a British archaeologist with a flair for the dramatic and a profound love for Homeric myth, acquired the land that covered the ancient ruins. Local farmers had been unearthing strange seals and artifacts, tantalizing clues that something colossal lay hidden beneath their feet. Evans commenced his excavation. What he unearthed would forever alter the history of the Aegean. He uncovered a palace so vast, so intricate, and so technologically advanced that he became convinced this was the mythical home of King Minos. The frescoes, the bullhorns, the sheer architectural strangeness of the site all pointed in his mind to one conclusion: the labyrinth. Evans wasn't just an archaeologist, he was a master storyteller, and at times a controversial one. He named the people who built Knossos the Minoans after Minos. He interpreted symbols, meticulously reconstructed frescoes, and restored parts of the palace using reinforced concrete, a decision that has drawn both praise and criticism. Some hail it as visionary, others denounce it as vandalism, because what you witness today at Knossos is a blend of ancient ruin and Edwardian imagination. Still, Evans achieved what no one else had dared. He breathed new life into Knossos. He offered Europe a glimpse into a Bronze Age world far older than classical Greece, a civilization characterized by art, mystery, and maritime elegance. He also unearthed the still undeciphered Linear A script, raising new questions about language, literacy, and the limitations of our historical understanding. But Evans did more than simply excavate stone. He resurrected a myth and compelled historians to confront the fact that behind the legend of the labyrinth lay something real, something complex, something profoundly human. A palace that felt like a maze, a civilization that faded into shadow, and a man who peeled back the earth only to discover a story far stranger and more beautiful than he had ever imagined. Knossos had slumbered for 3,000 years. Evans was the one who rang the bell that awakened it. To traverse Knossos is to journey through a language of symbols. Frescoes, carvings, patterns, they are ubiquitous. But the Minoans didn't bestow upon us a Rosetta Stone. Their primary script, Linear A, remains undeciphered. So instead of reading their thoughts, we must perceive them, etched across plaster, carved into walls, and concealed within intricate patterns. What precisely were they attempting to convey? The art of Knossos is unparalleled in the ancient world. There is no pervasive obsession with warfare, no endless rows of kings or battle-hardened heroes. Instead, we discover nature. Leaping dolphins, blossoming lilies, birds in graceful flight, and sacred bulls. The human figures are vibrant, elegant, often depicted dancing or engaging in rituals. Even in scenes that imply danger, there is an underlying rhythm and beauty. The Minoans were not chronicling conquests, they were celebrating life cycles and perhaps cosmic order. The most iconic symbol, however, is the double axe, or labrys. Found throughout Knossos in shrines, on frescoes, and even etched into stones, the double axe is believed to be a religious symbol, possibly connected to female divinity or celestial cycles. Some scholars suggest that the very word labyrinth might derive from labrys, rendering the labyrinth not a maze at all, but a house of the double axe, a sacred space, not a trap. Then there are the horns of consecration, stylized bullhorns placed atop walls and altars. These may have served as religious markers, delineating sacred space from the mundane. Combined with frequent depictions of bulls and bull-leaping rituals, it is clear that the animal held deep spiritual significance. Whether it represented nature, fertility, chaos, or a divine presence remains a matter of debate. But the bull is undeniably omnipresent. Even the layout of Knossos may possess symbolic meaning. Some archaeologists believe it was constructed not merely for functionality, but to mirror celestial or seasonal patterns. Its winding corridors and nested rooms could represent a journey through life, through death, or through the underworld. A spiritual maze rather than a physical prison. But without a deciphered script, every theory walks a precarious line between genuine insight and pure imagination. The Minoans communicated through symbols, not explicit narratives, and so we are left to interpret. What is Knossos truly conveying? We perceive the rhythms, we observe the images, but the ultimate meaning, that remains just out of reach, like a thread unraveling into myth. Knossos is undeniably a ruin, yet it doesn't feel lifeless. Walk its corridors today, and you'll sense something humming just beneath the surface. Not ghosts, not gods, but echoes of myths, of lives, of questions that stubbornly refuse to dissipate. Thousands of years after its decline, Knossos continues to hold us captive within its maze. Tourists explore its halls, archaeologists tirelessly seek answers, and writers weave new tales inspired by its enduring shadow. The Minotaur may be a myth, but the pervasive feeling of the labyrinth is profoundly real. We do not know who governed Knossos, We do not know the names of its kings, queens, or priests. We do not know the prayers they whispered or the laws they lived by. But we know they cherished beauty. We know they revered nature. We know they understood the delicate balance between architecture and art, between ritual and reality, and we know they were the pioneers. Before the Parthenon, before Rome, before the Hebrew temples or the Persian palaces, there was Knossos, a palace that was also a city that was also a temple that may have also been a story. Because perhaps that's what the labyrinth truly is. Not a prison, not a puzzle, but a narrative carved in stone, a myth in architectural form. The legend of the Minotaur didn't materialize from thin air. It originated from this very place, from the confusing nature of its corridors, the reverence of its bull rituals, and the profound awe it inspired in generations who struggled to comprehend it. The Greeks transformed it into a story. We transformed it into archaeology. But at its very core, Knossos has always been both. Today, we can explore its ruins in broad daylight. We can capture photographs, draw maps, and even reconstruct its frescoes. But the mystery has not vanished. The boundary between fact and legend still shimmers like heat haze over stone. Perhaps that's why Knossos endures, because it doesn't provide all the answers. It reminds us that sometimes history isn't meant to be solved. It's meant to be experienced. And Knossos, ancient, intricate, half-remembered, isn't just a location on a map. It's a profound question, one that draws us deeper with every step. And like Theseus, we're all still following the thread. Ancient engineers knew precisely what they were doing. The earliest battering rams were handheld. Teams of soldiers simply hoisted a tree trunk and slammed it against enemy defenses like frenzied lumberjacks. But over time, the battering ram underwent significant evolution. Engineers realized that mounting the ram inside a wheeled frame, often topped with a roof to shield the crew from arrows and boiling oil, transformed it from a mere tool into a weapon of terror. The Assyrians, masters of siege warfare, elevated rams into psychological weapons. Their siege towers combined rams with archer platforms, meaning a city's gates were being systematically destroyed while defenders endured constant projectile fire. Relief carvings from Nineveh depict rams with pointed iron tips advancing towards the gates of rebellious cities like slow-moving gods of destruction. And they weren't solely focused on the main entrance. Rams were frequently employed to breach weak points in walls, demolish watchtowers, or completely collapse gatehouses. Their very presence signaled one thing: surrender, or watch your defenses crumble like stale bread. The Greeks refined them. The Romans perfected them. Roman engineers constructed colossal rams called ares, Latin for ram, suspended by chains or ropes inside enormous siege shelters. Some were so immense they required dozens of men to operate, and the rhythmic swing of their massive beam was said to echo like thunder rolling across stone. And yet, for all their brute force, battering rams demanded serious teamwork. Operators had to maintain the ram's synchronized swing while simultaneously defending it from burning missiles, falling stones, and all manner of noxious substances hurled from above. A stalled ram quickly became a destroyed ram. Still, when a battering ram gained momentum, true momentum, it became virtually unstoppable. Wooden power versus human masonry. It was ancient physics, weaponized, and it was merely the beginning of how engineers would make walls weep. If the battering ram was the brute force, the catapult was the strategic mind. Where rams smashed up close, catapults attacked from a distance, launching not only stones but profound psychological dread. They represented the first true artillery pieces in military history, revolutionizing siege warfare by weaponizing physics in ways that seemed almost magical to the enemy. The earliest catapults emerged from the Greek world around the 4th century BCE, a product of brilliant minds seeking to extend the range and impact of warfare. Dionysius I of Syracuse, a tyrant with a penchant for cutting-edge violence, commissioned the first torsion-powered catapults, devices that utilized twisted bundles of sinew or hair as tension springs. These were not mere oversized slingshots. They were precise instruments designed for siege terror. The genius lay in their mechanics. Engineers discovered that by tightly twisting ropes, often crafted from animal sinew, they could store immense amounts of potential energy. When released, this stored force could hurl stones, javelins, or even flaming projectiles for hundreds of meters. The two main types rapidly evolved: the ballista, which launched massive bolts like a giant crossbow, and the stone-throwing catapult, which lobbed boulders over walls or directly at fortifications. Then came the Roman engineers, who invariably found ways to improve upon Greek innovations. They constructed catapults that could be dismantled, transported on carts, and reassembled on site, creating portable siege engines for professional armies. Some Roman catapults could launch 60-pound stones at incredible velocities, capable of tearing through wooden gates, battlements, and occasionally, unfortunate soldiers. Catapults weren't solely about destruction, they were about spectacle. Ancient generals employed them to transmit messages, sometimes quite literally. Corpses were launched over walls to spread disease and fear. Severed heads were lobbed into besieged cities to shatter morale. In one chilling instance, diseased bodies were fired into enemy territory as an early form of biological warfare. But catapults had their limitations. They were heavy, required skilled crews, and could be rendered useless by unfavorable terrain. Still, when properly deployed, they could batter a city into submission from a safe distance. And for the first time in history, cities realized their formidable stone walls didn't just need to withstand a ram, they had to endure attacks from the skies. Because now, destruction arrived airborne. If the catapult was clever, the trebuchet was majestic. Towering, groaning, and terrifying, it stood as the undisputed monarch of medieval siege warfare. When one appeared on the battlefield, it was more than just a weapon. It was a profound declaration. It proclaimed, "Your walls are meaningless." Unlike its tension-powered predecessors, the trebuchet relied on the fundamental force of gravity. At its core was a simple principle: a long swinging arm mounted on a sturdy frame with a heavy counterweight on one end and a sling on the other. Raise the weight, allow it to drop, and the arm would violently whip around, flinging the sling and its deadly payload in a high arc over enemy defenses. It was controlled destruction, precise, predictable, and utterly devastating. The origins of the trebuchet can be traced back to early traction models utilized by the Chinese as early as the 4th century BCE, where human power replaced counterweights. But the counterweight trebuchet, the version that would fundamentally reshape siege warfare in Europe and the Islamic world, emerged in the 12th century, possibly through Byzantine or Muslim intermediaries. Once Europe acquired the design, it proliferated rapidly through castles and crusades. Its power was astonishing. A well-constructed trebuchet could launch 300-pound projectiles over 300 meters. Stones the size of household furniture would crash into towers, pulverize walls, or decimate enemy morale. But the true magic lay in its arc. Unlike catapults, trebuchets could hurl projectiles over walls with remarkable finesse. This meant they weren't merely battering defenses. They were striking courtyards, barracks, and supply depots within the fortifications. And it wasn't just stones. Trebuchets launched everything imaginable: diseased animals, burning pitch, pots of lime to blind defenders, and even messages or insults wrapped around rocks. One legendary account from the siege of Stirling Castle in Scotland tells of Warwolf, a trebuchet so colossal that the enemy surrendered before it was even fired. The king, however, refused to accept the surrender, simply to test the magnificent machine. But for all its destructive glory, the trebuchet was not swift. It required hours to construct, minutes to reload, and demanded the expertise of skilled engineers. Still, no other siege weapon combined range, force, and psychological horror quite like it. It was the medieval equivalent of a slow-motion hammer descending from the heavens. And when that massive counterweight dropped, cities held their collective breath. While catapults launched from a distance and battering rams smashed the gates, siege towers employed a more direct, personal approach. They rolled directly up to the enemy's front door and disembarked armed invaders. Imagine a colossal wooden skyscraper on wheels, protected by wet hides to prevent fire, bristling with archers and spearmen. That was the siege tower, the ancient equivalent of an armored personnel carrier combined with a mobile fortress. And when one of these began rumbling towards your city walls, you knew that the true battle was about to commence. Siege towers were not subtle. They were immense, audacious, and terrifyingly effective when properly utilized. The Assyrians may have been among the first to deploy them in the 9th century BCE, but it was the Greeks, and particularly the Hellenistic kingdoms, who pushed the design to dramatic extremes. During the siege of Rhodes in 305 BCE, the Macedonian general Demetrius constructed a 9-story tower named the Helepolis, or Taker of Cities. It stood over 100 feet tall, was equipped with catapults, covered in iron plates, and propelled by thousands of soldiers. It also, unfortunately, collapsed under its own immense weight, but the sheer ambition behind it was unmatched. The logic behind siege towers was straightforward. Walls are effective only if you cannot surmount them. Siege towers negated that advantage by providing an elevated platform from which attackers could descend onto the battlements, circumventing gates and scaling ladders. From the top deck, archers could unleash a deadly rain upon defenders, while troops on the lower levels prepared to board. However, these towers were not invincible. They were slow, susceptible to mud, and prime targets for defenders armed with fire arrows, rolling boulders, or even cleverly sabotaged terrain. Clever defenders would dig ditches, flood moats, or construct secondary inner walls known as counterscarp defenses specifically to impede a tower's approach. Still, when they functioned as intended, their impact was spectacular. A breach in the wall was one thing, but having your own rampart suddenly overrun by enemy soldiers, that was utter chaos. Siege towers transformed the battlefield from a horizontal contest of strength to a vertical race for survival. They rendered height both an asset and a liability. And once the gangplank extended from a siege tower to the city walls, there was no turning back. It was time for brutal hand-to-hand combat. While battering rams smashed and trebuchets soared, some of the most devastating siege tactics unfolded silently beneath the earth. Siege tunneling, also known as sapping, was the clandestine art of defeating a city by literally undermining its foundations. The concept was ancient and terrifyingly effective. Dig a tunnel beneath the enemy's wall, support it with wooden props, and then ignite those supports. When the timbers burned away, the tunnel would collapse, taking the wall's foundation with it. One moment, your city stood strong. The next, a massive section of the outer wall would crumble like stale bread. This method lacked grand visuals. There were no elaborate engines or thunderous launches, but tunneling served as the slow, invisible killer of fortress warfare. The Assyrians practiced early versions of this, but the technique reached its full maturity with the Greeks, Persians, and later, medieval European armies. During the siege of Plataea in 429 BCE, the Spartans attempted to tunnel beneath the walls, only for the defenders to dig counter-tunnels and intercept them mid-dig, transforming the subterranean space into a nightmare of knife fights. This defensive tactic became known as countermining, adding an eerie dimension to siege warfare. Imagine soldiers digging in absolute darkness, hundreds of feet beneath the earth, straining to hear the faint sounds of enemy picks. The moment they detected tapping, they would race to intercept, often resulting in violent claustrophobic skirmishes fought by torchlight with knives and shovels. There was no glory in it, only terror, suffocation, and dirt. But when undermining succeeded, the results were catastrophic. One of the most infamous examples occurred in 1212 during the siege of Rochester Castle in England. King John's forces tunneled beneath the southern wall, packed the mine with pig fat, and set it ablaze. The supports collapsed, bringing down the entire tower above. The defenders were stunned and surrendered soon after. By the 13th century, siege engineers had become specialists in identifying weak foundations, predicting soil behavior, and orchestrating collapses with terrifying precision. They were, in essence, geologists and demolitionists combined. And though tunneling demanded time, immense labor, and a touch of madness, it proved one fundamental truth about siege warfare. If you couldn't go over the wall and you couldn't go through it, you could always bring it down from below. Not all the drama of siege warfare originated from the attackers. For every ram constructed or tower advanced, defenders possessed their own deadly stratagems, and sometimes those stratagems were exceedingly hot. Let's begin with the most terrifying of them all, Greek fire. Developed by the Byzantines around the 7th century CE, Greek fire was a mysterious, napalm-like substance that could adhere to ships, walls, and flesh, and continued to burn even on water. Sprayed from siphons or hurled in clay pots, it generated scenes of pure chaos. To this day, no one knows its exact composition. The formula was so closely guarded that it perished with the empire itself, but its effects were legendary. Entire fleets were reduced to flaming skeletons within minutes. And that was just the beginning. In more low-tech defenses, boiling liquids were the preferred weapons of choice. Boiling water, oil, or sand would be poured from murder holes, those seemingly quaint openings in the ceilings of gateways or towers, directly onto invaders below. Oil was particularly feared. Unlike water, it clung tenaciously to skin, saturating clothes and armor before igniting. Imagine ascending a siege ladder only to be met with an unquenchable inferno. Hot sand, while less visually dramatic, was vicious in its own right. It would penetrate the gaps in armor, especially around the neck or wrists, inflicting second- and third-degree burns as it slowly cooked the flesh beneath. It might not have looked impressive from a distance, but it transformed courageous warriors into screaming wrecks in mere seconds. Defenders also leveraged the fundamental laws of physics. Gravity became a weapon. Gigantic stones, massive logs, or even dead animals were dropped from parapets onto siege engines or dense troop formations below. The objective wasn't solely to kill, it was to simultaneously cripple the machines and shatter morale. And then there were the traps. Hidden pits, collapsing bridges, spiked barricades. Castles transformed into intricate puzzles of pain, meticulously designed to slow, confuse, and punish. All of this served one crucial purpose: delay. Every minute a wall held meant a minute closer to enemy supply lines dwindling, to disease spreading through their camps, or to reinforcements finally arriving. Siege warfare was a grueling game of attrition, and while the attackers had physics on their side, the defenders possessed ingenuity and an abundance of boiling rage. In siege warfare, raw destruction accounted for only half the objective. The other half was psychological domination, the art of breaking the defender's will before the walls themselves even fell. Siege weapons weren't merely tools of war, they were colossal, creaking, flaming symbols of impending doom. Every groaning wheel of a siege tower, every arcing boulder propelled by a trebuchet was designed to implant one terrifying idea in the minds of those behind the walls: you are not safe. Ancient commanders understood this implicitly. The Assyrians openly paraded their siege engines, dragging them across deserts with grand fanfare. The Romans constructed their siege camps directly in view of the enemy, allowing defenders to watch as battering rams were assembled and catapults underwent testing. Siege was theater, and fear was a crucial part of the script. Sometimes the projectiles themselves carried a message. Severed heads of messengers or generals would be launched over the walls, often still clad in their armor. At the siege of Constantinople, defenders were bombarded not only with rocks, but with bodies. Diseased corpses were launched to spread panic and plague. During the Mongol siege of Kaffa in 1346, it's believed that hurling plague-infected corpses over the walls contributed to outbreaks of the Black Death in Europe. The trebuchet wasn't just a weapon, it was a horrifying announcement. When one of these giants was moved into position, everyone inside the fortress could hear it before they saw it. The creaking of winches, the grinding of ropes, the heavy thunk of the counterweight, like the ominous heartbeat of an approaching storm. But the most perilous aspect? The sheer unpredictability. You never knew what would come next. Would it be a massive rock, a barrel of fire, a volley of arrows, or simply an unnerving silence? Ominous, heavy silence as engineers meticulously adjusted their aim. Even the sounds themselves became psychological weapons. The rhythmic thump of a battering ram, or the sudden, pregnant silence before a shot, could drive defenders to the brink of madness with anticipation. For commanders, the ultimate goal was to induce despair, to convince the enemy that continued resistance was futile, that their gods had abandoned them, and that their walls were nothing more than temporary obstacles in the path of inevitable fate. And when that mental dam finally fractured, the gates often yielded without a fight, because in siege warfare, sometimes the mind surrendered before the masonry. As gunpowder roared onto the battlefield in the late medieval era, the age of traditional siege engines gradually faded, ending in a slow, splintering demise. But their legacy didn't vanish, it transformed. The invention of cannons fundamentally altered everything. A single, precisely aimed shot from a cannon could achieve in seconds what a trebuchet took hours to accomplish. Stone walls, once considered impregnable, suddenly became grave liabilities. By the 15th century, Europe's magnificent castles were crumbling, not from undermining or fire, but from massive iron balls smashing through their parapets. Siege warfare had entered its next, explosive, brutal, and deafening phase. And yet, the fundamental principles established by ancient siege engineers never truly disappeared. Modern artillery still owes an immense debt to the catapult and trebuchet. Every ballistic missile and long-range howitzer is simply a high-tech descendant of the same core question: how do you break what's meant to be unbreakable from a distance? Physics, trajectory, tension, and brute force, all these concepts were discovered, tested, and perfected centuries before gunpowder ever entered the historical narrative. Even contemporary military psychology, shock and awe, overwhelming firepower, visible dominance, finds its roots in ancient siege tactics. Those towering siege engines, rolling forward with flags snapping in the wind, were the original shock and awe. They weren't solely intended to breach a wall. They were designed to shatter the spirit of an entire city. You can still witness their legacy etched into the ruins of ancient cities. At Masada, where Roman siege ramps still scar the desert landscape. At Constantinople, where layers of formidable walls stood for 1,000 years against every imaginable machine, until cannon fire finally brought them down. At castles across Europe, where the architectural evolution of round towers and angled bastions tells the story of a world constantly redesigning itself to withstand the next siege. And today, even in a world dominated by drones and satellite-guided missiles, siege warfare has not vanished. It has simply evolved into a digital form. Cities are still surrounded. Defenders are still isolated. Walls are now firewalls, blockades, or even media blackouts. But the fundamental essence of the siege remains unchanged. Someone desires entry. Someone desires to prevent them from entering. And both sides are willing to wait, to build, and to break in order to achieve victory. The battering rams are gone. The trebuchets are museum pieces. But the enduring spirit of siege warfare? It is as alive and as destructive as ever.